You think you are searching for God, but God has been watching you search. The seeker and the sought have never been separate, only mislabeled. Neville Goddard made a claim so radical that it still unsettles those who hear it too quickly. Imagination is God in action. Not imagination as fantasy, not daydreaming or wishful thinking, but imagination as the living, perceiving, assuming center through which all experience flows. He did not suggest that imagination points to God, or that it connects you to God, but that imagination itself is the operant power people have been calling God under different names. This is why arguments about belief eventually collapse. God, in Neville's teaching, is not an object to be believed in, but a function already in use. You are not asked to accept a theory. You are invited to recognize what has been acting all along. Consider how Neville described proof. He never asked anyone to accept his words on authority. He pointed instead to the simple sequence that governs every life. An inner act precedes an outer fact. Something is assumed, felt as real, accepted inwardly, and then, without asking permission from logic, the world reshapes itself to match that assumption. This is not mysticism layered on top of life. It is the structure of life itself. Every conviction you have ever lived from, whether deliberate or unconscious, has moved outward and clothed itself in events. The inner act does not shout. It does not announce itself as divine. It simply proves itself by becoming visible. This is where the realization begins to turn. God is not what you are waiting to experience one day in some heightened moment of clarity or grace. God is what has been experiencing through you the entire time. The awareness reading these words, the sense of I am that remains constant while thoughts, roles, and circumstances change, that is the seat of the power you have been searching for elsewhere. William Blake wrote that God is not afar off, but more truly ourselves than ourselves, and he was not speaking poetically. He was pointing to the strange intimacy of the divine, so close that it is mistaken for ordinary consciousness and therefore overlooked. When you hear this for the first time, the mind tries to convert it into an idea to analyze. It asks whether this is symbolic, psychological, or metaphorical, but the recognition Neville pointed toward does not arrive through reasoning. It arrives the way recognition always does, suddenly, quietly, and without argument. You do not reason your way into knowing your own name. You recognize it. In the same way, the realization that ends doubt forever does not come from accumulating evidence or winning debates. It comes when you notice that the power you attributed to God has never been outside the one who assumes, feels, and experiences life. This is why so many people miss it. They are looking for God as something to encounter, rather than noticing the one doing the encountering. They are waiting for imagination to show them God, not realizing imagination is already the showing. Once this begins to dawn, the search softens. The strain to believe relaxes, not because you have convinced yourself of something new, but because you have recognized something familiar that was never absent. God has not been silent. God has been speaking as your awareness, and when that is seen, not intellectually but directly, doubt does not need to be fought. It simply has nowhere left to stand. There is a subtle habit most people never question because it feels reasonable, even intelligent. It is the habit of looking for proof before allowing oneself to rest in certainty. Proof seems responsible. Proof feels like protection against disappointment. Yet, in the context of God and imagination, this habit quietly reverses the entire order of creation. Proof-seeking assumes that power lies outside awareness and must first demonstrate itself before trust is justified. Without realizing it, the seeker places God in the position of an external performer and themselves in the position of a spectator, waiting to be convinced. Neville exposed how deceptive this posture is by pointing to something utterly ordinary. Imagine walking into a room filled with light and beginning to search for electricity. You inspect the walls, the ceiling, the floor, wondering where the power might be hiding, all while the lights are already on. The very illumination that allows you to search is the proof you claim to be missing. In the same way, the awareness that questions God is already operating by the power it seeks. Proof is not absent. It is being used continuously, but because it feels familiar, it is dismissed as insignificant. The moment you look outward for confirmation of an inner power, that power becomes invisible to you, not because it stops working, but because you have defined it as something other than what it is. God in Neville's teaching does not announce himself with spectacle. He operates silently as assumption, as expectation, as the quiet, "this is how it is," that settles within you before any circumstance agrees. When you demand signs, you overlook the fact that every sign you have ever received followed an inner acceptance that came first. This is why proof-seeking keeps God hidden. It trains attention away from the source and toward the effect. It conditions the mind to trust outcomes more than consciousness, events more than awareness. Yet every outcome is downstream. Every event is an echo. The cause has already spoken by the time the world rearranges itself. When you insist on seeing before believing, you reverse cause and effect, and then wonder why the divine seems absent or unreliable. What Neville gently but firmly revealed is that the power shaping your life has never required your permission to operate. It has been assuming, feeling, and expressing through you long before you questioned it. Your deepest convictions, fears, expectations, and certainties did not wait for proof. They moved into fact because they were quietly accepted. The search for proof only begins when this inner operation is forgotten, when attention drifts from the one assuming to the things assumed. And here the pivot becomes clear. The power you have been trying to verify is not dramatic, loud, or mysterious. It is quiet, intimate, and constant. It has been operating unnoticed precisely because it feels like you. Once this is seen, the frantic need for signs begins to dissolve, not because you have been persuaded, but because you have noticed what has been functioning all along, lighting the room while you were busy searching for the switch. When you look honestly at your life, not through spiritual language but through direct observation, a pattern quietly reveals itself. Things that felt inevitable tended to happen. Things you secretly expected often arrived, even when you claimed you did not want them. And things you could not accept as possible rarely found a way in, no matter how hard you tried. This is not coincidence, and it is not fate. It is the same power expressing itself again and again, wearing different disguises, responding not to effort or desire, but to assumption. Neville described this power with disarming simplicity. Assumption hardens into fact, not instantly, not magically, but inevitably. The world reflects back what has been inwardly accepted as true, whether that acceptance was conscious or unconscious. You did not force most of the defining conditions of your life into being. They formed the way habits form, quietly, through repetition and familiarity. A habit does not require constant strain. It grows because it is returned to, believed in, and lived from without resistance. This is why force has never been the true engine of change. You may have struggled, pushed, planned, and worried, but those efforts only mattered when they were aligned with an inner sense of reality. When they were not, the effort exhausted you without producing results. The power that actually worked was never the strain. It was the silent acceptance underneath it. The feeling of, this is how things are, or this is how I am. Once that feeling settled, the outer world followed, often in ways that seemed natural in hindsight, even if they once felt impossible. Seen this way, persistence takes on an entirely different meaning. It is not the act of repeatedly trying to make something happen. It is the return to an inner position until that position feels normal. Just as a habit forms not by force, but by repeated acceptance, so does any state of being. You return to it. You live from it. And over time, it stops feeling like an assumption and starts feeling like fact. When that shift occurs inwardly, the outer confirmation is no longer a question of if, but when. This realization quietly dismantles the struggle so many associate with spiritual work. If assumption is the only power that has ever worked in your life, then effort is secondary and often unnecessary. The world has never been responding to how hard you tried. It has been responding to what you accepted as true. When this is seen clearly, persistence ceases to be exhausting. It becomes almost gentle because it is no longer about pushing against reality, but about remaining faithful to an inner fact until it no longer feels like something you are doing, but something you simply are. Persistence is returning to inner fact, not forcing results. There is a quiet misunderstanding surrounding persistence that causes unnecessary struggle. Many assume persistence means holding tension, maintaining intensity, or repeatedly checking whether something is working. This interpretation turns persistence into a kind of inner pressure, as though reality must be coerced through constant mental effort. Neville pointed in a very different direction. Persistence, as he described it, is not force applied to the future, but fidelity to an inner fact that already feels established. The analogy is simple, yet revealing. Imagine returning home after being away for a long time. At first, the space feels unfamiliar. You notice details you once ignored, but as you come home again and again, the unfamiliar fades. The house stops announcing itself. It simply feels like home. Persistence works the same way. You're not trying to convince the house that it belongs to you. You are allowing yourself to remember what is already yours. Each return softens resistance, not through effort, but through familiarity. When persistence is understood this way, the need to monitor results begins to dissolve. Checking the outer world for confirmation only pulls attention away from the inner state that actually matters. The state becomes stable, not because it is defended, but because it is revisited until it feels natural. The moment a state feels natural, it stops needing reinforcement. It has crossed the threshold from something imagined into something accepted. At that point, struggle has nothing left to accomplish. This is why Neville emphasized returning rather than holding. Holding implies strain. Returning implies ease. You may wander, doubt may arise, old reactions may surface, but none of these undo the state unless they are accepted as final. Persistence simply means coming back, again and again without drama, until the inner fact feels more familiar than its opposite. Over time, the effort fades, not because you stopped caring, but because caring is no longer required to sustain what has become normal. Once this shift occurs, the entire process changes character. What once felt like work becomes almost passive. The mind no longer argues, the body no longer resists. The assumption settles into place, and with it comes a quiet sense of inevitability. At that point, forcing results would be not only unnecessary, but impossible. The state has already taken root. And when something feels like home, you do not struggle to stay there. You simply live from it and the world adjusts accordingly. Subscribe now. This channel is a place you return to, again and again, until what has always been working through you becomes unmistakably clear. Few phrases are repeated more casually and misunderstood more deeply than the idea of letting go. It is often presented as a preliminary step, as though one must release desire, stop caring or detach emotionally before anything meaningful can occur. Yet in Neville's teaching, letting go is never the beginning of creation. It is the natural consequence of completion. When letting go is attempted too early, it feels like loss, suppression, or resignation. When it occurs at the right moment, it feels like rest. Neville referred to this moment as the Sabbath, not as a day on the calendar, but as an inner condition. The Sabbath is the state in which the work is finished, not because the outer world has confirmed it, but because the inner act has reached its conclusion. The analogy is almost mundane. You do not keep hammering once the nail is set. Continuing would not help. It would only damage what is already secure. In the same way, mental effort beyond completion is not faithfulness. It is a misunderstanding of the process. This distinction reveals why so many struggle with surrender. True surrender is not giving up. It is stopping because there is nothing left to do. Resignation stops because of exhaustion or disappointment. Surrender stops because of fulfillment. One is heavy and reluctant, the other is quiet and natural. The inner feeling is unmistakable. When the state has been entered fully, attention no longer circles the desire. The mind does not rehearse it. There is a subtle sense of finality, as though a conversation has ended without needing to be continued. Once the Sabbath is reached, effort feels out of place. Striving would suggest that something is still missing, and that suggestion would reopen the state that was just completed. This is why letting go cannot be forced. It happens on its own when the assumption has been accepted deeply enough to feel settled. The desire dissolves not because it was denied, but because it has been inwardly satisfied. Seen clearly, letting go is not a technique. It is a symptom. It is the quiet exhale that follows inner completion. When this is understood, the confusion surrounding surrender falls away. You do not let go to make something happen. You let go because within, it already has. The feeling of "it is done" is God recognizing himself. There is a moment in this inner work that cannot be manufactured, only noticed. It is the moment when movement stops, not because of fatigue, but because there is nothing left to move toward. Neville often pointed to this moment with the phrase, "It is done," yet he did not mean excitement, relief, or celebration. He was describing a very specific inner stillness, one that feels complete in a way that does not ask to be revisited. This feeling is not emotional in the ordinary sense. It is quieter than happiness and deeper than confidence. It resembles the calm that follows the signing of a document or the sealing of an agreement. Once a signature is placed, the transaction is finished. There is no need to negotiate further or explain anything again. The signature does not argue for itself. It stands as final. In the same way, the feeling of "it is done" ends the inner conversation without drama. Neville described this stillness as the creative closure. The imaginal act has reached its natural end, and the mind recognizes that continuing would add nothing. This is not indifference. It is certainty without tension. The desire no longer pulls attention toward the future because it has been satisfied in consciousness. The future, in a sense, has already been lived inwardly, and there is nothing left to anticipate. At this point, something profound occurs. The awareness that assumed the state recognizes itself as the source of the fulfillment. This is not an intellectual conclusion. It is a recognition that feels personal, intimate, and unmistakable. God, as imagination, recognizes his own creative act and rests. The striving self, the one that worried and tried, has no role here. It fades not through effort, but through irrelevance. This is why this feeling prepares the way for a deeper shift. When the sense of "it is done" settles, the old identity begins to loosen naturally. The one who was seeking, waiting, and hoping no longer fits the inner landscape. Without force or rejection, that identity starts to fall away, making space for something quieter and more stable to take its place. There is a tendency to think of transformation as a battle, as though the old self must be confronted, defeated, or forcibly removed before something new can emerge. This way of thinking carries unnecessary aggression into a process that is, by nature, gentle. Neville never spoke of destroying the old self through effort or denial. He spoke of replacement. When a new state is entered fully, the old one does not need to be attacked. It simply loses relevance. The analogy of outgrowing clothes captures this perfectly. Clothing that once fit no longer feels wrong because it was rejected, but because the body has changed. There is no anger toward the old garment, no need to tear it off dramatically. It is set aside naturally, without ceremony. Identity works the same way. The beliefs, reactions, and self-concepts that once felt accurate fall away when they no longer correspond to who you are inwardly occupying. Violence toward the old self only reinforces its presence. Struggle keeps attention anchored to what is being resisted. Neville understood that attention is creative, and wherever it rests, life follows. By refusing to fight the old identity, you deprive it of the only thing that sustains it. The new state does not overpower the old one. It replaces it by being lived from consistently and quietly. As this replacement occurs, the shift is often subtle. There is no dramatic moment where the old self announces its departure. Instead, you notice that certain reactions no longer arise, certain thoughts feel foreign, and certain patterns fail to repeat themselves. What once felt automatic begins to feel optional or even irrelevant. This is not loss, it is maturation. The inner center of gravity has moved. Once this movement has taken place, the outer world has no choice but to respond. Life rearranges itself to reflect the identity being expressed from within. This response is not something you manage or supervise. It unfolds as naturally as the shedding of clothes that no longer fit. The old self does not need to be killed. It needs only to be outgrown, and in that quiet outgrowing, transformation completes itself without struggle. Once an inner state has been genuinely entered, something curious begins to happen. The impulse to interfere slowly weakens, even though the mind may still attempt to reassert control. Questions about how things will unfold, who will be involved, or what sequence events must follow tend to arise from an older identity that believes reality requires supervision. This identity assumes that if attention is not constantly applied to outcomes, momentum will be lost. Yet Neville's teaching quietly overturns this assumption by revealing that the world has never been rearranged by effort. The need to manage outcomes is rooted in the belief that the individual self is the source of causation. From that perspective, letting go of control feels risky, even irresponsible. But when a state is truly assumed, The sense of authorship begins to shift. You no longer feel like the one making things happen. Instead, you become aware of being the one from whom things are happening. This distinction is subtle but profound. The moment the destination is entered inwardly, the route ceases to be a personal project. The analogy Neville implied is simple and revealing. When you know you are already at a destination, you do not sit down and calculate every step required to get there. The steps appear as needed. Doors open without prior announcement. Conversations arise without planning. Movements occur without deliberation. The route reveals itself only because the destination has already been accepted as real. In the same way, once a state is inwardly occupied, life begins to express that state through a sequence of events that could not have been designed in advance. This is where much unnecessary tension dissolves. The mind often assumes that clarity must precede movement, that understanding must come before action. Yet in lived experience, it is often the reverse. Action emerges first, clarity follows later. When the inner assumption has shifted, you may find yourself doing things that feel natural but unremarkable in the moment, only to realize afterward that those actions were essential links in a larger chain. The intelligence guiding this process does not explain itself while it works. It simply works. Delays, from this perspective, take on an entirely different meaning. When someone believes they must force outcomes, a delay feels like resistance or failure. It triggers doubt and renewed effort. But when the destination is inwardly settled, delays lose their emotional charge. They no longer threaten the outcome because the outcome is not being waited for internally. It is already assumed. Time becomes a neutral medium rather than an obstacle. What once felt like waiting now feels like unfolding. Neville described this as God arranging the means, but this phrasing can be misunderstood if taken too literally. It does not imply an external being stepping in to manipulate circumstances on your behalf. It points to the inherent responsiveness of reality to consciousness. The same power that forms assumptions also coordinates events. Once the assumption is stable, the coordination begins automatically. People enter and exit your experience without explanation. Opportunities appear through ordinary channels. Obstacles dissolve without confrontation. None of this requires instruction or effort from the individual. This understanding removes the compulsion to interfere. Interference often comes from anxiety, and anxiety arises from the belief that the process is fragile. When you see that the process has its own intelligence, interference begins to feel unnecessary, even counterproductive. Trying to manage the unfolding can reintroduce the old state, the one that assumes lack, uncertainty, or separation from power. Non-interference in this context is not passivity. It is alignment. As this becomes clearer, trust ceases to be a practice and becomes a consequence. You are no longer trying to trust. You are observing that things move without your help. The world responds, adjusts, and reorganizes itself around the state you are living from, not because you direct it to, but because it has always done so. The rearrangement is not dramatic or theatrical. It is quiet, practical, and often obvious only in hindsight. And when you finally see how seamlessly it unfolds, the need to manage life begins to dissolve, replaced by a deeper confidence in the power that has been arranging everything all along. There comes a point where explanation reaches its limit. Words can clarify, analogies can point, and logic can soften resistance, but none of these can substitute for direct experience. Neville understood this and placed the state akin to sleep at the center of his teaching, not as a technique to master, but as a condition in which argument naturally falls away. SATS is not important because it produces visions or sensations, but because it suspends the very faculty that keeps God theoretical rather than known. In ordinary waking consciousness, the mind is busy asserting itself. It evaluates, compares, doubts, and narrates. It wants reasons before acceptance and explanations before rest. In this state, even the idea that imagination is God can remain abstract, something discussed rather than recognized. Satius gently interrupts this habit. As the body relaxes and the mind slows, the constant commentary loses its grip. The need to analyze weakens not through effort, but through fatigue. What remains is awareness without argument. Neville described this state as the threshold where the conscious and subconscious meet, but this description only gestures toward what is actually happening. In SATS, the sense of separation softens. You are no longer trying to convince yourself of anything. You are simply present. And it is in this presence that imagination reveals itself not as a mental tool, but as the very substance of experience. The imaginal act, when entered in SATS, does not feel like pretending. It feels like participation. This is why SATS is not about visualization skill. Vivid images may appear or they may not. What matters is the quiet acceptance of a state without resistance. The moment the mind stops arguing, the veil thins. Not because something new arrives, but because the noise that obscured what was always there has settled. The feeling of reality shifts inward. The imagined scene, sensation, or outcome is no longer observed from a distance. It is inhabited. At this level, God ceases to be an idea inferred from philosophy or scripture. God becomes the immediacy of experience itself. You are not thinking about imagination. You are being imagination. The sense of I am fills the scene rather than standing outside it. There is no effort involved in maintaining it, because effort belongs to the thinking mind, and the thinking mind has grown quiet. What remains is a gentle certainty that does not need reinforcement. Neville emphasized that this is where true creation occurs, not because SATS is magical, but because resistance is absent. In waking consciousness, opposing thoughts constantly interrupt assumption. In SATS, these interruptions lose their force. The acceptance of the state happens without negotiation. The assumption slips past the gatekeeper of logic and settles directly into feeling. This is why the experience often carries a sense of finality. It feels done, not because you decided it was done, but because there is no impulse to continue. In this stillness, recognition becomes possible. God is no longer something you are trying to understand. God is the awareness resting in the fulfilled state. The same presence that imagines is the presence that experiences. There is no gap between the two. This is why SATS is described as a divine encounter, not because a being appears, but because separation disappears. The experiencer and the power being experienced are seen as one. When this is touched, even briefly, theory loses its appeal. Arguments about belief seem distant and unnecessary. You are not persuaded, you are acquainted. And that acquaintance carries a quiet authority. SATS does not demand repetition for reassurance. It leaves an impression that lingers, a knowing that does not depend on mood or circumstance. From this point forward, God is no longer something you think about. God is something you have met as yourself, in the silence where the mind stopped arguing and awareness remained. When everything settles, what remains is not a new idea to carry forward, but a recognition that quietly rearranges how everything is seen. Neville's final teaching was never about gaining power or mastering a process. It was about realizing that God and imagination are not separate. They are the same activity, experienced from within. The awareness that imagines is the awareness that lives, feels, and perceives. Nothing else has ever been operating in your life. This understanding simplifies what once felt complex. What assumes and feels is what creates, continuously and without exception. Long before you questioned faith or explored these ideas, this power was already shaping your experience. It formed identities, habits, expectations, and outcomes through acceptance rather than effort. Imagination did not wait to be trained. It acted as you, through you, expressing whatever was inwardly accepted as true. James Allen captured this same principle by observing that life reshapes itself around accepted inner truth. Not truth as philosophy, but truth as agreement. What is inwardly agreed upon becomes outwardly expressed. This is not reward or punishment. It is correspondence. The world answers the state you live from, not the words you repeat or the effort you apply. From here, striving naturally falls away. If God is imagination, and imagination is already active, effort cannot strengthen it. Effort only implies doubt. Neville was clear that God does not require strain, vigilance, or anxiety. God requires only consent, and consent is not forced. It arises when resistance ends. This is why everything returns to rest. When the state feels finished within, the work is complete. The outer movement will follow because it must. God becomes undeniable at that moment, not as an idea proven by thought, but as the simple fact of what completed the state in you. When that is seen, the seeker dissolves, because what was sought is revealed as what has always been creating.